I didn't cry when the lawyer stopped reading. I sat in a mahogany chair that felt like a cage, watching my father's reflection in the polished table as he handed me a single key. I walked away with a collapsing shipyard cottage on the Maine coast that no one else wanted, while my sister inherited the liquid heart of the family firm. My grandmother had bypasses the family probate by placing Ironwood into an irrevocable trust years ago, naming me the sole successor trustee. Legally, the land was mine the moment she passed, leaving my father with no power to intervene. My father's words are still echoing in my head. She gave you exactly what you could handle, Isabella. A project to keep you small. My breathing remained rhythmic. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a tremor. 4 months later, my phone rang at 10 o'clock at night. It was the contractor. He spoke 5 words that chilled the air in my lungs. Isabella, the walls are talking. At that point, would you have walked away from the millions to find your own peace? Or would you have stayed to fight a battle you weren't sure you could win? Ironwood didn't offer me a welcome. It offered me a draft that smelled of wet cedar and 60 years of abandonment. I moved my life into 3 rooms that hadn't seen a heater since the late 90s, while my father and mother remained in their climate-controlled fortress in New York. I've always known the Vance silence. It's a specific brand of psychological warfare, where they don't use fire to destroy you, they use frost. They simply stop looking at you until you start to doubt your own existence. Truth be told, I think that was always the plan, to push me out to the jagged edges of the coast until I became as invisible as the history they were trying to overwrite. In hindsight, I realized they expected me to come crawling back to the firm within 48 hours, begging for a junior associate position and a dry apartment. I sold my sedan for $42,000 in cash, a crucial retainer to keep Elias and his crew on site. I did the grueling demolition work myself, blisters bleeding under my gloves, while I traded my architectural consulting services to Elias's brother to cover the heavy lifting costs. I didn't need a status symbol. I needed liquid assets and a heavy coat. I traded leather seats for a used truck and enough fuel oil to keep the pipes from bursting during the first Maine freeze. The psychology of our family was built on image-obsessed erasure. In my father's world, if a project had a flaw, you didn't fix the structure basing your reputation on a lie. It was easier if you just moved the camera angle. I was the flaw in their perfect family portrait because I was the only one who remembered the actual blueprints. By exiling me here, they weren't just giving me a house. They were attempting a retroactive deletion. They wanted to see if I would wither away when I was no longer being fed by the Vance prestige. But there is a certain clarity that comes with being discarded. When you stop being an asset to people who only value transactions, you finally get to see the actual cost of your life. I spent my first 2 weeks at Ironwood stripping back layers of yellowed wallpaper and listening to the house groan under the weight of the wind. I lived on black coffee and protein bars, my body leaning out until I was nothing but sinew and focus, mapping out the decay of the joist with the same precision I once used to design $10 million city parks. It was during the 3rd week that I saw the first anomaly. I was underneath the porch, clearing away decades of rotted lattice, when I found a modern surveyor's stake driven deep into the permafrost. It was marked with high-visibility orange paint, barely faded by the salt air. I touched the cold plastic and felt a shift in the internal logic of my exile. My father had told the entire family this land was a worthless liability, a ruin that even the county ignored. Yet, someone had been here recently, measuring the earth beneath my feet. Some things don't break all at once. They fracture quietly, long before the collapse becomes visible. I've always been a ghost in my father's drafting room. For 5 years, I was the one who translated his vague, grandiosely titled visions into actual, buildable site plans. When the city awarded the Vance firm the contract for the riverfront park, I spent 3 weeks straight working 18-hour days to perfect the drainage elevations and the structural integrity of the stone overlooks. At the unveiling, I sat in the 10th row of the gallery, watching my father stand at the podium in a $3,000 suit, accepting the Architect of the Year award for my work. He didn't even look in my direction. That's when I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I was a silent investor in his version of genius, and my dividends were paid in the form of a condescending pat on the shoulder. If I'm being honest, I think I accepted this cottage because I needed to see if I could build something that didn't have his name stamped on the title block. But as I began to strip ironwood back to its skeleton, I realized Harrison Vance had been here long before he gifted me this ruin. While clearing the rot from beneath the east porch, I found another mark, a professional surveyor's pin from 10 years ago, hidden behind a concrete footer. My father had claimed he hadn't stepped foot on this property in decades. Yet the earth told a different story. I went inside and retrieved my grandmother's old brass drafting compass. It's a heavy, cold instrument, worn smooth by 40 years of her hands. I began to measure. I've always had a sensory intuition for space. Something about the living room felt mathematically off. I measured the exterior footprint, 36 feet. Then I measured the interior wall from the corner of the kitchen to the edge of the hearth, 34 feet, 6 inches. There was an 18-inch discrepancy, a void space running the entire length of the central load-bearing wall that didn't exist on any of the tax maps I'd pulled from the town hall. It took me years to understand that Harrison Vance never does anything without a secondary exit strategy. He didn't leave me this house because it was a burden. He left it to me because he was terrified of what would happen if a stranger started tearing down these walls. He was betting on my poverty to keep his secrets buried in the cedar. But he forgot one thing about architects. We don't just look at the surface, we look for the fracture. Harrison didn't wait for the frost to set. By the first Monday of November, the digital umbilical cord that connected me to the Vance firm was severed. I went to log into the archive to pull the soil composition reports for the Maine coast, and my credentials were gone. Error 404, access denied. This wasn't a glitch, it was a tactical blackout. My father knew that for someone like me, data is oxygen. By cutting off my access to my own designs, he was trying to suffocate my professional identity. He even attempted to have my AIA license suspended, citing mental instability, but Ironwood was a private residence, and in this county, my name still carried my grandmother's weight, not his. Looking back now, I see it was a classic siege maneuver, starve the occupant until they open the gates themselves. The next morning, the financial pressure shifted from professional to personal. I went to use the corporate-linked debit card at the local hardware store for 25 pounds of masonry nails and 3 gallons of sealant. The transaction was declined. I tried again. Decline. I checked my balance on my phone, sitting in the cab of my truck while the heater rattled. The account had been drained to 0. My father hadn't just stopped the flow of capital, he had clawed back the reserves I'd earned through 5 years of uncredited labor. I'll admit, I expected the call that followed. It came at exactly 11:45 a.m., a time Harrison chooses because it interrupts the transition to lunch, a subtle way to assert dominance over someone else's schedule. His voice was smooth, devoid of the jagged edges of the previous month. He sounded like a man offering a settlement to a difficult contractor. He told me that he and my mother were concerned about my living conditions. He mentioned that Ironwood was a liability they shouldn't have burdened me with. Then came the offer, $200,000 in cash, upfront, if I signed the deed back to the family trust and vacated by the 1st of December. At the time, I didn't realize how much he needed me to say yes. To him, $200,000 was a rounding error in a waterfront deal worth $15 million. To me, standing in a shipyard cottage where the temperature in the kitchen was 42 degrees, it was a fortune. I looked at the 3 cans of tomato soup on my counter and the pile of architectural sketches I'd made of the living room's void space. I realized then that some people don't want you to succeed because your success is a direct audit of their failure. They didn't want me to have a project. They wanted me to have a prison with a view. I told him no. I didn't give him a reason, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply let the silence stretch until he was the one who had to hang up. But refusing the money meant accepting the consequences. I began selling my remaining firm shares, the small equity stake my grandmother had insisted I receive on my 25th birthday. I sold them at a 20% loss just to get the liquidity I needed to keep Elias and his crew on the payroll. I was burning my bridge to the Vance empire to pay for the shovel I was using to dig up its secrets. By the end of the week, Elias had reached the load-bearing wall in the study. He pulled back a sheet of rotting cedar and looked at me with an expression that combined confusion and genuine alarm. "Isabella," he said, "this isn't a wall, it's a vault." The vault didn't open with a mechanical click. It opened with the dry, protesting sound of cedar being pried away from a history it was never meant to protect. Inside the void space sat a brass tube, wax-sealed and lined with lead, a moisture-proof time capsule designed by someone who understood that the Maine coast eats anything that isn't protected. Elias stepped back, wiping plaster dust from his forehead, but I didn't move. Elias didn't just hate city money. His grandfather had been cheated by my father's firm back in the 70s over a local pier contract. For him, helping me keep this secret wasn't just a job, it was a long overdue debt of justice against the Vance name. I waited for the dust to settle before I reached in. I've spent my entire career looking at the skeletons of buildings, but I had never seen a structure hold its breath quite like this one. Inside that tube, I didn't find jewelry or stacks of currency. I found something far more lethal to a man like Harrison Vance. I found the architect's ledger. The vellum was cool to the touch, smelling of beeswax and the sharp, metallic tang of old ink. As I unrolled the first sheet on my makeshift plywood desk, I realized my grandmother hadn't just been a silent partner in the firm. She had been the primary custodian of the land patents. There were maps from 1952, hand-drawn and notarized, detailing the air rights and waterfront deeds for the entire Vance Development District. But it was the ledger tucked beneath the maps that made the air in the room feel thin. It was a meticulous record of every commercial lease payment diverted from the grandmother's trust over the last 23 months. My father's signature was everywhere, sharp, arrogant strokes that claimed $850,000 in income that legally belonged to a woman he was busy mourning in public and erasing in private. Looking back now, I realize that the most dangerous weapon you can possess in a family built on image is a paper trail they forgot to burn. Information isn't just power. It's the only currency that doesn't depreciate in a house full of liars. If I'm being honest, I felt a strange sense of relief. The betrayal was finally documented. It was no longer a vibration in the air or a cold look across a dinner table. It was a series of ink-on-paper facts. But a ledger isn't a victory. It's just a roadmap. I spent the next 72 hours in the basement of the Cumberland County Registry of Deeds. It was exhausting, meticulous work that left my eyes burning under the flickering fluorescent lights and my fingers stained with the gray dust of ledger spine. I cross-referenced the 19th century boundary lines with the modern GPS coordinates of the waterfront project Harrison was currently trying to sell for $15 million. I worked through the nights, fueled by black coffee and the clinical need to ensure my foundation was ironclad. The clerk at the registry, a woman who had seen 50 years of property disputes, watched me with a quiet curiosity as I requested volume after volume of archived titles. I didn't tell her who I was. In my world, you don't reveal your hand until the stakes are high enough to bankrupt your opponent. By the end of the third day, the truth was undeniable. The multi-million-dollar waterfront my father had already contracted to a private equity group didn't belong to the Vance firm. It belonged to the Ironwood estate, and as the sole heir to Ironwood, the entire $15 million deal now sat squarely in the palm of my hand. This wasn't a discovery, it was an audit. Harrison didn't send a lawyer this time, he came himself. At 11:45 p.m., the headlights of his black SUV swept across the peeling cedar of the cottage like a searchlight. I watched from the window, my grandmother's brass compass still heavy in my pocket. He stepped out, his charcoal overcoat pristine against the mud of the shipyard, looking like a man who had misplaced his empire and expected me to hand it back. If I'm being honest, I expected him to shout. I expected the loud, performative rage he used to silence boardrooms. But when he walked through the door, the air didn't explode. It just went cold. He looked around the gutted living room, his lip curling at the exposed framing and the vellum tube sitting on the plywood table. He started with the concerned father script, the one Eleanor must have rehearsed with him. He talked about my erratic behavior and the unfortunate toll the grief had taken on my mental health. He suggested that I was seeing ghosts in the walls, hallucinating patterns in old paperwork that didn't exist. It was a classic gaslighting maneuver designed to make me doubt the very ground I was standing on. But looking back now, I realize his calmness was just a thin veneer over a structural failure. He wasn't worried about my health. He was worried about the $15 million closing date that was 48 hours away. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my sanity. I simply waited for him to finish his monologue. When the silence finally became uncomfortable for him, I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the confirmation of a lis pendens my attorney had filed with the court and the title company 2 hours earlier. I watched his eyes scan the document. I watched the moment the blood left his face, leaving him gray in the harsh light of the work lamps. The buyer's lead counsel, a man who looked like he hadn't smiled since the Reagan administration, closed his laptop before I even finished speaking. He knew that in the face of a title cloud, his client's $15 million investment was dead in the water, and he wasn't about to let them sign a tainted contract. I told him quite clearly that the waterfront sale was now legally stayed pending a full forensic audit of the Ironwood deeds. The shift was instantaneous. The predatory mogul vanished, replaced by a gentleness that was far more repulsive than his anger. He tried to put a hand on my shoulder, his voice dropping an octave into a forced paternal warmth. He talked about working this out as a family and correcting the administrative errors of the past. It was a desperate market correction. A man who builds his life on a foundation of lies is always looking at the sky, waiting for the first crack to appear. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just the crack. I was the entire collapse. I walked to the door and held it open. I didn't need to say another word. The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to be documented. The hearing wasn't a movie scene. There were no gasps from a gallery or dramatic last-minute witnesses. It was a series of dry, devastating legal filings presented in a room that smelled of old paper and industrial floor wax. Looking back now, I realize that the most effective way to dismantle a lie isn't through a shouting match. It's through the slow, rhythmic ticking of a forensic audit. My attorney, Marcus, who treated every sentence like a surgical incision, presented the lis pendens alongside the original land patents and my father's forged signatures. The judge didn't even look up when she ordered a permanent injunction on the $15 million waterfront sale. She simply moved her pen, and in 3 seconds, the Vance empire lost its anchor. It took me months to understand that professional exile is a special kind of death for people like Harrison and Eleanor. They weren't led away in handcuffs, but they were stripped of the only thing they actually valued, their relevance. The court-mandated audit revealed the full scope of the $850,000 in diverted lease income. They were forced to liquidate their secondary holdings just to satisfy the clawback order. But the real blow came from the board of directors. By the end of the week, my father's voting rights were suspended indefinitely. He went from being the architect of the century to a material witness in a federal fraud investigation. I watched from the back of the boardroom as they were escorted out. Eleanor's face was a mask of practiced politeness, but her eyes were darting toward the exits, looking for a camera angle that no longer existed. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt the quiet, cold satisfaction of a balanced ledger. If I'm being honest, I realized then that some people aren't worth the emotional energy it takes to hate them. Hate is a form of investment, a subscription to a person's influence that I was no longer willing to fund. This was my silent exit. I didn't need a tearful confrontation or a hollow apology. I simply removed them from my narrative with the same clinical precision I'd used to delete a corrupted file. I changed my number. I moved my professional records to a private server. I drew a perimeter around my life that was as ironclad as the Ironwood patents. Some things don't break all at once. They just become obsolete. Sabrina was the only one who tried to bridge the gap. She came to the cottage 2 weeks after the final ruling, standing on the porch with her designer luggage and a look of profound, uncharacteristic silence. She told me she was leaving the firm and moving to California. She didn't ask for money, and she didn't defend our parents. She just looked at the restored cedar of the house and told me I was the only one who actually got out. I didn't tell her she was forgiven. I didn't tell her I missed her. I simply nodded and watched her drive away. In my family, we were raised to believe that loyalty was a debt we could never finish paying. I finally realized it was a debt I had never signed for in the first place. Ironwood finally breathes with the rhythm of the tide. 1 year after the final injunction, the cottage is no longer a shipyard ruin or a vault of hidden shames. It is a land rights archive, a clean white oak sanctuary where the blueprints of the past are preserved behind glass, rather than buried behind cedar. The $15 million waterfront is now a public land trust, And the $850,000 in recovered assets have been funneled into a foundation for young architects who refuse to let their names be erased by the men in the boardrooms. Looking back now, I realize that I didn't just restore a house. I restored the sequence of my own life. The legal dust has settled into a quiet, permanent distance. Harrison and Eleanor Vance live in a self-imposed exile in a smaller, leased apartment 3 towns away from the social circles they once dictated. They aren't in rags, but they are socially and professionally irrelevant, a fate far more clinical and devastating for people who built their identities on the shifting sands of image. I haven't spoken to them since the day the board revoked their voting rights. If I'm being honest, I don't feel a need for a grand reunion or a tearful apology. Forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's just the moment you realize you are finished with the transaction. I close the account and I'm no longer interested in the balance. There is a profound masterpiece of architecture in a life built on truth. It's a structure that doesn't require a constant marketing budget or a team of lawyers to keep it standing. It took me 32 years to understand that boundaries are not an act of war. They are an act of structural integrity. I used to believe that family loyalty was a load-bearing wall I was required to support at any cost. I was wrong. My parents weren't the foundation. They were the rot. And by clearing them away, I finally allowed the real legacy of my grandmother to take root in the soil they tried to poison. I spend my evenings on the porch now, watching the fireflies flicker against the dark line of the coast. I still have the silver bracelet from the original story of Rowena Rose in my mind, but here I have my grandmother's brass compass. It sits on my desk, a heavy reminder that a true north doesn't change just because someone tries to redraw the map. I admit there is a phantom pain that lingers, the quiet ache of the family. I thought I had the sister who is currently rebuilding her life in a studio apartment 400 miles away, and the parents who chose a lie over their own daughter. But that pain is a small price to pay for the clarity of owning my own name. If I've learned anything from the walls of Ironwood, it's that truth has a weight that fear can never match. When you hold the truth with steady hands, it will carry you farther than a lie ever could, even if the road is cold and the house is in ruins when you arrive. You don't owe silence to the people who benefit from your invisibility. You don't owe your identity to a foundation that was built to keep you small. Sometimes the hardest step isn't the fight itself, it's giving yourself permission to walk away from the people who tell you that you aren't enough. I'm no longer an associate at someone else's firm. I am the architect of my own horizon. The air here is sharp, clean, and entirely mine. The Ironwood cottage stands firm, its foundation anchored into the granite, its walls no longer holding secrets, only the quiet, enduring strength of a woman who finally learned to measure her own worth. Have you ever held a truth so heavy you thought it would break you, only to find it was the only thing holding you up? I'd really like to hear your perspective.